Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I am joined by La Christophe.
Oh, La Christophe. Maybe that can be my new stage name. No. Hey, good to see you, Dale.
It's good to be seen.
Yeah. So what's new? What's going on?
Picture a boy standing at the edge of a stone quay in southwestern Scotland, maybe 8 or 9 years old, watching merchant ships work their way up a tidal channel towards a port he isn't allowed to work in yet. His father tends the gardens of a gentleman's estate. His family lives in a cottage on someone else's land, in a country where the difference between the manor house and the gardener's cottage is not a difference of degree. It's a difference of species, as far as 18th century Scotland is concerned. That boy's name at this point in his life is just John Paul. No Jones yet. That comes later, and for reasons that will get himself killed twice over, in a matter of speaking, if he isn't careful.
Wait, what? Sorry, continue.
He's born July 6th at Arbigland, an estate on the Solway Firth in Kirkcudbrightshire, the fourth of 7 children and one of only 5 who survived to adulthood. Ordinary, brutal arithmetic for a working family in the 1700s. His father, also named John, is the head gardener at Arbigland, a skilled and respected tradesman, but a tradesman all the same, with no standing to pass down and no fortune to leave behind. What young John Paul has, instead, is proximity to the sea. The nearby port of Carthum is close enough to walk to, and he does constantly, dunking his schoolwork at Kirkbean Parish School to hang around the docks, climb over moored ships, and talk to sailors who've seen more of the world in a season than most of Kirkcudbrightshire will see in a lifetime. For a boy with no land, no title, and no prospects on shore, the sea's the one place in the world where none of that matters as much as whether you can do the job. So at 13, he does the thing that thousands of Scottish and English boys do in this era. He goes to sea as an apprentice, indentured to a Whitehaven shipping firm run by a merchant named John Younger. His first voyage puts him aboard a ship bound across the Atlantic, and is not a gentle introduction. He lands first in Barbados, then sails on to Virginia, where, in a detail that matters more than it sounds like it should, his older brother William has already immigrated and set up as a tailor in Fredericksburg. That connection, a Scottish brother working a trade on the banks of the Rapid, is going to matter enormously in about 15 years, when John Paul needs somewhere in the world to disappear to. But for now, he's just a ship's boy, learning the actual physical trade of sailing. Knots, sail handling, navigation, the ceaseless maintenance that keeps a wooden hull afloat across an ocean, under men who have no particular reason to be gentle with him. He's good at it. Genuinely, unusually good at it. In the way that gets noticed by captains who don't hand out compliments. By his late teens, he's already serving as third mate and then chief mate on transatlantic voyages. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable in a way we are not going to smooth over. Some of the voyages are slave ships. In 1764, at 17, Paul serves as third mate aboard the King George, engaged in the Atlantic slave trade. And 2 years later, he moves up to first mate on a second slaver, the Two Friends, operated out of Kingston, Jamaica. This is not a detail biographers invented to make him complicated after the fact. It's a documented stretch of his early career, and it sits there permanently next to everything that comes after. To his limited credit, Paul leaves the slave trade in 1768, later describing it in his own words as a abominable trade. I'm not pronouncing that correctly.
Abominable?
Abominable, yeah. Abominable trade. He wanted no further part of it, whether that's a genuine moral reckoning or a young man realizing the work was beneath the competency he actually wanted is something history can't fully settle, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. What happens next is the accident that makes his entire career possible. In 1768, sailing home from Jamaica as a passenger aboard the brig John, both the captain and the ship's chief mate die of yellow fever in the same voyage. And John Paul, 21 years old, with no formal commission and no family name behind him, is the only man aboard qualified to bring the ship home. He does it. He brings the John and her cargo safely into port, and the ship's Scottish owners are impressed enough to make it official. They give him permanent command of the vessel, and with it, at 21, a captaincy most men wait decades to earn. It's not glamorous, a small merchant brig working Caribbean trade routes, but it's real command, earned through raw competence. In the one moment, competence mattered more than pedigree. That's the pattern of his entire life, over and over. John Paul, later John Paul Jones, gets his opportunities not because the world hands them to him, but because everyone standing between him and the job happens to die, quiet, quit, or fail at the worst possible moment for them and the best possible moment for him. It's going to happen again. And the next time it happens, it isn't going to be yellow fever. It's going to be a man's blood on the deck of a ship in the Caribbean and a name he has to invent to survive it.
What an introduction to a life. So let me tell you, at 21, I was not given commission of anything. I could drive a car, but that's about as far as the trust that the establishment was willing to put into my hands. Amazing. I do want to touch on the indentured servitude. I think that's very interesting because I don't know how many people out there conflate it with slavery, although similar, there is a distinction. One, you're getting money. There's an exchange for this servitude. And so somebody's getting money, whether it's the person being indentured, I should say, or a family member. And then there's a limited span of how long you do it for. And so once the time's up, you're done. It's not perpetual slavery, which I guess in this case, we wouldn't have probably heard of John Paul Jones in that case. Also, this kid hanging out in the docks instead of going to school, I understand. I think that shows a very early passion in a way that when you identify in a child, it is wonderful to encourage, and then they can end up being just excellent in that field. And I think we see through not only this beginning introduction of his life, but as we go forward and see what he's able to accomplish is indeed the case. I am so fascinated with how competent this guy is and how quickly he rises up to the ranks. And as you say, some of it is fortune, I guess bad fortune on the end of those that were ahead of him. Imagine you're on a passenger ship and then the people in charge of it die and it's, hey, buddy, you can drive this thing, right? That would be concerning to some, but I'm sure to him, yeah, absolutely.
It was a merchantman,
the helm.
not a passenger ship. He was just a passenger on it.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's a good clarification. Still, it's a good thing he was on that ship. I imagine if he wasn't, that's not typical to have a lot of passengers on a merchant ship, or is it? I'm not too familiar with this period of time.
There really wasn't a dedicated passenger ship type
It's just
thing.
we're going here
Yeah, and
with stuff and people,
yeah, except for maybe state-sponsored ships that
like a diplomatic envoy or something.
more like, here's a bunch of families, we want you to go and settle this area for king and
Right.
country.
Okay. That makes sense. Yes, and there was quite a bit of that at this time as well. Okay. Yeah, super impressed so far. I'm sure it's going to be, oh, yes, with you, Dale, with the way that you're conveying this story. And to a lesser extent, to John Paul. He's okay. Let's hear more about him.
Command, it turns out, is where John Paul's temper starts causing him real problems. And in the 18th century merchant marine, real problems can mean a body count. In 1770, while commanding the merchant ship John, he orders the flogging of a crewman named Mungo Maxwell, the son of a locally prominent Tobago family, for what Paul considered dereliction of duty. Flogging itself isn't unusual. It's brutal, standard shipboard discipline in this era, applied by captains across every merchant marine in the Atlantic world. What makes this one different is what happens after. Maxwell later transfers to another ship, and within weeks, he's dead. His family, with real social standing in Tobago, doesn't accept that as coincidence. They bring charges. The Admiralty Courts in Tobago investigates and clears Paul. The medical evidence doesn't support a direct link between the flogging and Maxwell's death, and a second inquiry back in Scotland reaches the same conclusion. Twice, formally, the law says John Paul did not kill Mungo Maxwell. The Maxwell family never accepts that verdict, and the accusation follows him for the rest of his life, whispered in ports, towns from the Caribbean to London. That's the captain who flogged a boy to death and bought his way out of it. Then in 1773, it happens again. Except this time there's no ambiguity about who died, and no trial at all. Paul is commanding the merchant ship Betsy in Tobago when his crew, unpaid and furious, moves towards outright mutiny. Paul confronts the ringleader, and in the fight that follows, runs the man through with his sword, killing him.
Whoa.
Paul always maintained he acted in self-defense against an armed mutineer, and it's entirely plausible that he did. Mutiny in this era is a genuine, often lethal threat to any captain who doesn't meet it with force. But the dead man is a local. Tobago's colonial authorities are not inclined to give a Scottish captain the benefit of the doubt twice. And Paul knows exactly what a jury stacked against him looks like. Rather than stand trial for a hanging offense, with the Maxwell rumor already trailing him, he does the only thing that gives him a chance at a future. He runs. He disappears from Tobago entirely, on the advice of friends who tell him bluntly that a fair trial isn't an offer, and travels incognito through the Caribbean and up the American coast for months, a wanted man with no name he can safely use. He resurfaces in the winter of 1774, not in Tobago, not in Scotland, but in Fredericksburg, Virginia, at the doorstep of his brother William, the tailor, who has conveniently just died and left an estate with no heir to claim it. And here's where John Paul makes the decision that defines the rest of his identity. He adds a surname, Jones. Nobody knows for certain where he pulled it from. Theories range from a Willie Jones of North Carolina who may have sheltered him to simple invention. But from this point forward, the fugitive Scottish sea captain wanted for a killing in Tobago does not exist anymore. In his place is John Paul Jones, a mysterious, well traveled ship's master newly arrived in Virginia, with no obvious criminal past, and as it happens, absolutely superb timing, because the 13 colonies are about to go to war with the most powerful navy on Earth. And that war is going to need experienced sea captains, far more than it's going to need clean records. What's remarkable and worth sitting with, honestly, is how little Jones's past actually catches up to him in America. The Continental Congress, scrambling in 1775 to build a navy from nothing, no ships, no officer corps, no institutional experience at all, is not running background checks on men. What it needs is men who have actually commanded ships across the open ocean, who understand rigging and navigation and the brutal practical mathematics of keeping a wooden hull and its crew alive. And there simply aren't many Americans who fit that description. A Scottish born merchant captain with a genuinely impressive service record, a taste for aggressive action, and, not incidentally, zero ties to the British establishment he's about to make war on, is close to exactly what the infant navy is looking for. So, in the fall of 1775, John Paul Jones travels to Philadelphia, walks into the middle of a Congress arguing about whether an American navy should even exist, and offers 10 years of hard-won seamanship to a service that, as of that exact moment, consists of a handful of converted merchant ships and a piece of paper. It's an audacious move for a man traveling under a name he invented 18 months earlier. It's also unmistakably the correct one.
I gotta ask a question, maybe more to the audience and myself, to you, but feel free to answer. If you're on the run, your name is known as, hey, this is the guy that ran a guy through with a sword and potentially flogged a guy to death. So you're trying to escape this past burden, and you do so by keeping your name exactly the same and just adding an extremely common surname, but you're still a Scottish ship captain, and you look like the same guy, and you have the same skill set as the same guy, and as you're trying to petition to help an infant country with their navy, you refer to the same record. I am astonished that this guy doesn't get caught, like that justice doesn't meet him. But I suppose it is a different day, like way before internet, cell phones, DNA, all the tools of a modern police system. This guy just says, you know what? I'm out of here. I'm going to sail over there. Hey, I'm just going to add. It's not like he changes his name to Rodrigo or anything. I'm still John Paul. Oh, but it's Jones. You must be confusing me with that other John Paul. Yes, I've heard of him. No connection. He's Scottish too? I can't believe it. He does ships? Yeah, me too. But that's where the similarity ends. I'm John Paul Jones. How does somebody get away with this? I guess that's the question.
It's so much easier back then than it is now because there's no paper trail. There's no passports. There's no identification papers or anything like that.
You just show up.
Most of these guys aren't even literate.
I will say the 13 colonies were surprisingly literate. They had a huge number of newspapers, but I don't know how much of the folks in service, like John Paul was formerly with the British Merchant Marines, what their literacy rate was, because I know that when they came to America, they were shocked to see such high literacy rates. Yeah, that's fascinating to me. I can't believe that this guy was able to. Anyway, and the
biggest thing is it's just distance. The further you get away, and you can just say, "Hi, I am blankety blank," and there's no way to prove or disprove it. So it's just okay. We accept it.
Exactly, and you're such a relatively new installation as a country or a state, we'll say. hey, we need all the help we can get. You have a skill set? Come on in. And that's just incredible to me. Anyway, what you were saying earlier also about how people died. So his brother died, and there was no heir to the estate. And so he, as John Paul Jones, has to claim the estate on behalf of John Paul, I assume. I'm not sure how that inheritance works, but I'm sure they went close enough. You're from Scotland. I'm sure you all know each other. Or something like that. That's nuts. Anyway, the fact that he had committed those crimes in the Caribbean and was on the lam put him at the right place at the right time for his contribution to the revolution, which I find almost fatalistic. It's just incredible. But let's see how he progresses through this next journey of his life.
And one last thing about the whole alternate identity thing. There's nothing about with people going like in the Caribbean saying, "Hey, if you see this guy, send him to us. We need him." Like there is today.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you leave the area
Right.
unless the Tobago authorities travel up. Nobody's gonna care. Nobody's gonna grab him, and so
Right.
you just got to stay
I
away from that
assume
area.
if he did some radical crime, like he had assassinated the King of England, there would be a search. But smaller country, more difficult travel, like there's so many advantages in this time to somebody who is on the lam. So yes, I totally agree.
Okay, so Congress commissions Jones as a senior lieutenant in December 1775, assigning him to the frigate Alfred, flagship of the Continental Navy's very first squadron under Commodore S.E. Hopkins. And on December 3rd, 1775, in the harbor at Philadelphia, Jones does something he will spend the rest of his life reminding people he did. In letter after letter, sometimes to the point of tedium, he personally hosts the Grand Union flag, the new nation's first unified naval ensign. 13 red and white stripes with the British Union Jack still sitting in the canton. Up the halyard of the Alfred with his own hands. Quote, "I hoisted with my own hands the flag of freedom the first time it was displayed on board the Alfred." He'll write that to the President of Congress years later. And it's true as far as it goes, though it's also exactly the kind of detail Jones never lets anyone forget he provided. Self-promotion is not a flaw that develops in him later in life. It's baked in from the very first flag. What isn't baked in, at least not yet, is respect from fellow officers. When Congress issues its first formal seniority list of Continental Navy captains in October of 1776, Jones is ranked 18th, despite being, by any honest measure of raw seamanship, more experienced and more capable than the large majority of men above him on that list. The reasons are political as much as professional. Seniority in this brand new Navy is shaped heavily by connections, colony of origin, and congressional patronage, none of which Jones has, because 6 months earlier he was still a foreign-born nobody with an invented last name. Jones is furious, and he says so repeatedly in writing to anyone in Congress who will listen. And here's a uncomfortable truth buried inside that fury. He's not wrong about his own ability. And being right about that doesn't make him easier to work with. This is a pattern that's going to recur for the rest of his naval career. Jones will consistently deliver on the water. Jones will consistently alienate the people who control his promotions, his ship, and his reputation, because he cannot let a perceived slight go unanswered for the rest of his life. What he can do in May 1776 is prove the list wrong with results. Promoted to captain and given command of the small sloop Providence, Jones takes her out on a 6-week commerce raiding cruise along the New England and Canadian coast that is, by any measure, a genuine masterclass in aggressive, independent command. Operating almost entirely on his own initiative, hunting British shipping and coastal targets with no fleet to support him and no orders more specific than do damage. Jones captures 16 prize vessels in that single cruise.
Whoa.
Merchantman transports fishing craft, while also raiding and burning British fishing operations off Nova Scotia that are supplying the Royal Navy's blockading squadrons. His first prize, the Brigantine Active, falls on November 11th off Cape Breton. The very next day, he takes the 350-ton armed transport Militia, loaded with winter uniforms and supplies bound for British troops in Canada. A capture so materially useful to Washington's freezing Continental Army that it's arguably worth more to the war effort than most contemporary land engagements. 3 more Colliers fall off Louisburg on November 24th. This is not the work of a mediocre captain buried 18th on a seniority list. This is a man operating a single small sloop like it's a one-ship war and doing more actual damage to British interests in 6 weeks than most captains above him manage in a year. And it's already generating exactly the resentment you'd expect. Jones's aggressive, personally led command style, climbing into the action himself, taking risks his superiors considered reckless, and then writing detailed, self-congratulatory reports about it afterwards, makes him spectacularly effective and spectacularly hard to serve alongside. Fellow captains who watch an 18th ranked Scotsman rack up 16 prizes while their own more cautious cruises produce far less don't necessarily respond with admiration. They respond more often with the particular resentment reserved for the colleague who's clearly better at the job and never lets you forget it. That resentment is going to follow Jones onto bigger ships, into a French alliance, and eventually into open, bitter warfare with a fellow American captain that nearly costs him everything at the exact moment he needs allies most. But that's still ahead. For now, in the fall of 1776, John Paul Jones has done something almost nobody else in the infant Continental Navy has managed. He's made the British Empire shipping genuinely afraid of one small American sloop, commanded by a man Congress didn't think was worth ranking above 17 other men.
What a complicated guy. There is something that I admire about doers, people that take action and initiative. And John Paul Jones is clearly one of these guys. And people like that are supremely capable are individuals that I make an exception for when I have to deal with somebody whose personality is very abrasive or borderline narcissistic.
Sorry.
And this guy seems, it's okay. You're very capable. So you're on the good side of the ledger. But when you're dealing with somebody who's incompetent and all about themselves, that's just hell. You don't want to deal with that. They don't help you. They don't help themselves. They don't help the common goal. But when you have someone that is incredibly capable, that might make you look worse only because they are so excellent, you have to change your perspective. You're all on the same team. And if you're doing your duty to the best of your ability, keep doing that. And if he's doing his duty to the best of his ability and he's outpacing you 3 times, 4 times, that's good news for your side. And I imagine that even though in America they tried to issue titles and there was still loftiness, there was still, you could see it in the early drafts of the documents as far as what colonies which colonies thought they were more important than the others. Virginia. But this is raw performance and accomplishment and merit. And he's just doing what he has grown up learning to do best. And like you said earlier, a lot of folks would get captain commissions when they were older. So this is a young guy out there just kicking butt. And all these older guys are like, oh, what an upstart. I can't believe it. What? And change your perspective. When you have an existential threat like the British Navy bearing down on you, it's good to have someone like John Paul Jones on your side. I'll leave it at that.
By 1777, Jones has convinced Congress to give him something bigger: command of the newly built sloop of war Ranger, and orders to carry the war across the Atlantic into British home waters. A mission almost nobody else in the Continental Navy has the nerve or the seamanship to attempt. He crosses in the fall, arrives at the French port of Nantes in December, and within weeks has traveled to Paris and met the man who is about to become the single most important relationship of his entire career: Benjamin Franklin, America's senior commissioner in France, already a celebrity across Europe, and critically for Jones, a man who recognizes real naval talent and is willing to spend his own diplomatic capital protecting it. Franklin and Jones become genuine friends, not just professional allies. And that friendship is going to be the single load-bearing relationship that keeps Jones's career alive through every disaster still ahead of him. The first payoff comes on February 14th, 1778 in Rhone Bay, off the French coast, in a moment that's easy to skip past but shouldn't be. A French warship, the Robuste, under Admiral La Motte Piquet, fires a formal 9-gun salute to Ranger and the brand new stars and stripes flying above her. It's the first time a foreign warship of any nation salutes the American flag under the new design.
Huh.
Congress adopted in 1777. A small, almost bureaucratic sounding moment that is, in real terms, France's first tact acknowledgement on the open water that the United States is a nation worth saluting. Jones understood exactly what he'd witnessed and made sure everyone back in Congress heard about it in detail. Then, on the night of April 22nd into the 23rd, 1778, Jones does something no American naval officer had done before or will do again for the rest of the war. He leads an actual raid onto British soil, taking 2 boats and 30 volunteers from Ranger under cover of darkness. Jones aims for the harbor at Whitehaven, not coincidentally the same port where he'd apprenticed as a 13-year-old boy, a place he knows intimately. Defended by 2 small forts he'd watched being built as a child. The raid does not go cleanly. Jones had hoped to hit the harbor at midnight, low tide, when its roughly 400 merchant ships would be sitting helpless in the mud. Instead, rowing troubles delay his boats until near dawn. His own boat successfully storms the southern fort and spikes its guns without a shot fired in resistance. But the second boat, tasked with the northern fort, turns back without attempting the attack at all. Improvising, Jones sets fire to a collar in the harbor to compensate for the aborted second landing. And though the blaze does real damage, it's a fraction of what he'd planned. Still, for the first time since the war began, British civilians wake up to the sound of an American raid on English soil. And the psychological effect, out of all proportion to the actual material damage, is enormous. English coastal towns start fortifying against a threat most of them assumed the war would never bring to their own doorstep. From Whitehaven, Jones sails directly to the Salfirth, to Kirkcudbright Bay, his home waters, literally within sight of the estate where he grew up, with an audacious follow-up plan: kidnap the Earl of Selkirk, a prominent local nobleman, and hold him as a bargaining chip to force better treatment for American prisoners of war in British hands. The plan collapses almost immediately when Jones's landing party discovers the Earl isn't home. Rather than return empty handed, his men loot the estate's silver instead, an outcome Jones is visibly uncomfortable with, given that it looks less like a prisoner exchange operation and more like simple theft from a family that had nothing to do with the war. He'll later personally purchase the stolen silver back from his own crew out of his own pocket and return it to the Selkirk family years afterwards with a apologetic letter, a strange telling detail about a man capable of real moral discomfort over a raid he himself ordered. 2 nights later, on April 24th, Ranger finds and engages HMS Drake, a Royal Navy sloop of war of comparable size, in the North Channel between Ireland and Scotland. And in a decisive single ship action, fought without any of the improvisational chaos of Whitehaven, Jones's crew methodically outfights and captures her, killing Drake's captain and first lieutenant in the process. It is the first clear-cut American naval victory of the entire war fought in British home waters. And Jones brings his prize triumphantly into Brest, France, a hero on both sides of the Atlantic.
Good clarification.
Wow. Okay.
Hey, man, we got to keep it real.
It is real. That's what the city's name is.
I know. In an audio medium, it might throw people off. That's all. Continue. Sorry.
Congress and the American press eating up the story of Whitehaven and Selkirk and Drake all in the same eventful week. While the British press runs furious editorials demanding to know how an American privateer managed to burn a British town and raid a British earl's estate without the Royal Navy stopping him.
How audacious do you have to be to sail all the way in the middle of the Revolutionary War, where the British Navy clearly has the numerical advantage, to go to their home waters and then siege a town that, I can't even, sorry, I'm trying to complete the sentence, and siege a town on their home turf, which I'm sure they thought was unimaginable. From what I understand, this is the first attack on their island since the Battle of Hastings from a foreign power. So from 1066 to this time, nobody attacked. That can't be right, because what about the Vikings? I gotta check my facts. Sorry, Navy history buffs. I think
that's the English Navy history podcast anyway, not us.
Yeah, we're gonna take the credit here as Americans. This was the first time America did this to England. There we go. How about that? Indisputable. I think that's just the most brash thing you can imagine. And the volunteers, who were the guys sailing with John Paul Jones who are like, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And then they do it. And then they try to kidnap somebody. He's not home. We'll just loot his house. This guy is a pirate in disguise. This is what I've determined. All the prize ships, all the excellent seamanship. This guy was born to be a pirate, but just landed in the service of the U.S. Navy, which works out, because that's like a guaranteed letter of marque that takes you anywhere you need to go. And I'm sure the French were thrilled. The French and the English were not the best of friends for a very long time. And so anything you could do to undermine the English, France is all about it. And yes, they would have celebrated him quite remarkably. And what a psychological operation that would have been. That must have been similar to the bombing of Tokyo early on, right after Pearl Harbor. The
Doolittle raid?
Doolittle raid, yes, thank you. I was trying to serve it up to you so you could answer. No, I just didn't remember. Anyway, that was psychologically very impactful because the Japanese realized, oh, we can get hit at home. And so the English are also thinking of this. I'm sure that made them make different decisions in this conflict. So this is incredible. And perhaps, I'm not saying there were not gutsier things in this conflict, but this is amongst the top gutsy plays on the American side.
Fame, it turns out, does not translate directly into a new ship. After the triumphant return to Brest, Jones spends most of the following year stuck ashore in France, increasingly frustrated, while Congress and the American commissioners and the French government argue endlessly over what command, if any, to give their newest transatlantic celebrity. Franklin works the diplomatic channels on Jones's behalf, and it's worth being direct about how much this matters. Without Franklin's specific, sustained advocacy, resisting pressure from rival commissioner Arthur Lee, who actively distrusts Jones and wants him shipped back to America, Jones's European career likely ends here, becalmed in Brest, with no ship and no mission. Compounding the frustration is a rivalry that's about to turn genuinely dangerous. Captain Pierre Landais, a French-born officer given command of the American frigate Alliance, develops an immense mutual dislike for Jones, almost from the moment the two men are forced to operate in the same theater. A is erratic, proud, and increasingly resentful of the more talented and more famous Scottish-American captain, competing for the same scarce French resources and the same congressional attention. That resentment is not going away. It's going to resurface at the worst possible moment, in the middle of the most important battle of Jones's life. And the consequences of that timing are still going to be argued about centuries later. By early 1779, Franklin finally secures Jones a real command. Though secures undersells how improvised it actually is. Jones takes an aging, converted French East Indiaman, a merchant ship well past her prime, and rebuilds her into a warship. In a gesture of genuine gratitude and no small amount of calculated diplomacy, Jones renames her Bonhomme Richard, or Poor Richard, in direct tribute to Franklin's widely popular Poor Richard's Almanac, first published decades earlier under Franklin's own pseudonym. It's the kind of move that tells you exactly how well Jones understood the value of Franklin's friendship. Not a subtle nod, but a 40-gun frigate wearing the man's nickname across the stern. Around Bonhomme Richard, Jones assembles what can only honestly be described as a strange patchwork squadron. American colors flying over ships that are mostly French-built, French-crewed, or French-financed, commanded by a mix of American, French, and other European officers who don't always agree on much, including, critically, who's actually in charge. Alliance, under the increasingly unstable Landais, is part of this squadron. So is the frigate Paulus and several smaller vessels. It is on paper an impressive force. In practice, it's a command structure built on compromise, competing national interests, and personal grudges that Jones, as Commodore, has neither the formal authority nor the diplomatic patience to fully control. In August 1779, the squadron sails from the French port of Groix with orders to raid British commerce and harass the coastline. Essentially the Whitehaven mission again, but at a much larger scale, with a much larger and much less reliable force under Jones' command. What follows is not a clean, well-executed cruise. Ships desert the squadron outright. Landais, in alliance, reportedly operates independently of Jones's signals, sometimes disappearing for days at a time, sometimes actively ignoring direct orders in ways that would constitute open insubordination in a properly disciplined Navy. Except this isn't quite a properly disciplined Navy, and Jones' actual authority over Landais remains murky enough that nobody fully resolves the question before it matters most. The squadron works its way slowly up around the western coast of Ireland and Scotland and back down towards the North Sea and England's eastern coastline, taking prizes as it goes. Jones, increasingly aware that this cobbled together command is one serious test away from falling apart entirely. That test arrives on the evening of September 23rd, 1779, off a stretch of Yorkshire coastline called Flamborough Head. Jones' lookouts spot sails on the horizon. A large merchant convoy, more than 40 ships, carrying naval stores and timber down from the Baltic to English ports. Exactly the kind of high-value commerce target the whole cruise has been built around. But this convoy isn't undefended. Shepherding it are two Royal Navy warships, the modestly armed Countess of Scarborough, and a much more serious problem, a brand new, well-built 44-gun frigate named Serapis, under an experienced and capable British captain named Richard Pearson, who has absolutely no intention of letting his convoy be taken without a fight. Jones, watching those sails from Bohom Richard's quarterdeck, understands immediately that everything about this cruise, the desertion, the friction with Landaeus, the entire patched together squadron, is about to be tested against a genuinely dangerous opponent in a fight neither side is going to walk away from unmarked.
I've heard about this conflict, and it's very exciting. Won't give too much away. Do want to correct a few things I mentioned earlier. One, there were several attacks on England between the Battle of Hastings and the Whitehaven attack. Countless. So apologies to the people of Scotland and France, who did many of them. Thank you for your service against our common enemy, in a way. I'm glad we can sort that all out. Two, the attack on Whitehaven, I remember, was foiled a little bit in a couple of ways that I found interesting. One, his crew wanted to get drunk, and so when they landed while John Paul Jones is trying to set stuff on fire, a bunch of his guys are in the pub like, hey, let's quote-unquote find a light, but rather let's get lit. That's what they actually were trying to do, and it caused some problems. I think that's a funny part of the story. John Paul Jones, just the decisions he makes, I can understand. I can see why he rubs people the wrong way, at least his contemporaries. It's cool to have benefactors and people on your side like Benjamin Franklin, and naming your ship after that guy, that's a classy move, I gotta say. That, I cannot, given his record, I'm still astonished that people deserted his fleet. Because, I don't know, let me ask this to you, Dale. If you have a leader like John Paul Jones, how do you feel about listening to his orders? And this is beyond the fact that as a sailor, you're supposed to follow the orders of whomever is in command anyway. But if the leader is John Paul Jones, what would your take be?
That depends on how he is towards his crew. We know that most of his conflicts come with the people above him or equal to him. But from what I understand, he was pretty well loved by his crew. He fought with them. He did not step back. So if I was on his crew, it would just depend on how he treated me. If he treated me awesomely, I would be like, yay! But if he treated me like crap, I'd be like, you know what? I'm going to do the very little I can to not get hornswoggled by you.
I know he has a history of semi-mutinous crews, and I'm sure that's a result of some poor treatment.
It's because if you don't get paid, you're going to get ticked, and you're going to be like, well, if you're not going to pay me, you're not going to be my captain.
It's like I'm working for money. If there's no money, there's no work. But it's very clear.
It also could be the owner of the boat not paying them, but of course he's at the command, so he's the one who gets blamed.
That's, hey, modern world, your problems have existed for some time, and I think this is indicative of that. Gosh, okay, so with all this behind him, as far as conflicts with crew, conflicts with peers, low underdog ranking, if you will, and then all these ships he seized, the political, what's the word I'm looking for?
Wrangling?
Loggerheads. There we go. I haven't used that word in forever. The political loggerheads. He's about to engage in just even more just offensive behavior, not in the demure cultured way, but in the military way. And I think this is what makes him such an effective commander. He doesn't stop, and he does everything he can to undermine his enemies. And this, I think, is one of the classic battles that demonstrates that. So let's get into it.
Hold two images in your mind simultaneously as this fight begins, because both of them are true at once. In one, you have the Bohom Richard, an old, slow, structurally compromised converted merchantman, undergunned for her size, crewed by a mixed bag of American, French, and even some pressed British sailors, commanded by a man whose entire squadron is barely under his control. In the other, you have the Separus, newer, faster, built better, more heavily and more reliably armed, commanded by a career Royal Navy officer who knows exactly what he's doing and has every material advantage on his side. By any reasonable measure of ship-to-ship combat power, Richard Pearson should have won this fight comfortably. But he doesn't. Or that he doesn't is the entire reason anyone still tells this story 250 years later. The two ships close in fading evening light, and the engagement opens exactly as badly as it possibly could for Jones. Bohom Richard's main battery includes a set of old 18-pound cannons mounted low in the hull. Guns that, it turns out, are simply too old and too poorly cast to survive full combat loads. In the first exchange of fire, two of these 18-pounders catastrophically burst on Richard's own gun deck, the barrels literally exploding under the pressure of their own charges, killing and maiming the gun crews, working them, and tearing a hole in Jones's own hull before Separus has fired more than a handful of shots. It's not an exaggeration to say Jones loses a meaningful fraction power of his heaviest firepower to his own defective equipment in the opening minutes of the battle. The naval engineering equivalent of a boxer breaking his own hand on the first punch. What remains of that lower gun deck is abandoned outright. Jones cannot risk what's left of his heavy battery blowing up entirely. This should be the moment the fight effectively ends. Instead, it's the moment Jones makes the single tactical decision that defines his entire career. Rather than trade broadsides with a better armed opponent from a position of permanent disadvantage, a fight his crippled ship simply cannot win at range, he drives Bohom Richard directly at Separus and orders his crew to lash the two hulls together. It's a desperate, unconventional choice. It's also, given what just happened to his main battery, close to the only rational one left. If he can't outshoot Separus, he can try to outfight her at a range where his advantage in boarding capable manpower, including a detachment of French Marines and sharpshooters positioned in Richard's rigging, might actually matter more than raw broadside weight. Pearson, for his part, initially resists the grappling, recognizing correctly that being physically bound to a burning, sinking American ship is not obviously in his interest. But Jones' cruise makes the lashing stick, and by full dark, the two ships are locked together, muzzle to muzzle in places, unable to separate, fighting essentially as a single burning structure adrift on the North Sea. What follows for the next several hours is some of the most brutal close-range combat of the entire Age of Sail. Cannon fired at ranges of mere feet, muskets and grenades exchanged across gunwales, close enough to touch. French marksmen in Richard's rigging picking up Separus's exposed crew on her open deck below. And through all of it, Here is the detail that gets lost in mythology. Boham Richard is genuinely, seriously sinking, taking on water faster than her pumps can clear it, burning in multiple places. Her hull, already so badly damaged from the early exchange and the point blank cannon fire, since that surviving crew members will later testify they can't believe the ship could stay afloat much longer, regardless of who won the fight. Jones is not commanding from a position of hidden strength. He is fighting a battle he is visibly, physically losing on the ship beneath his own feet, in real time, in front of his entire crew, with no way to disguise it from anyone aboard either vessel. It's into this exact moment, his own ship dying under him, his heaviest guns already destroyed, hours of close range slaughter still ahead, that the exchange everyone remembers or thinks they remember is supposed to have happened.
Whenever I look through the historical record and see a conflict where it seems so lopsided and so obvious which way it's going to go, history is replete with those stories. It's okay, this is what happened, move on, let's see what happens with the next battle or conflict. Or maybe sometimes dig deeper and say, how did this affect the overall war effort? Because in defeat, in overwhelming defeat especially, there can be psychological implications, there can be logistical problems. Like earlier, even when he captured the ships with the winter coats, imagine being a British soldier in Canada, waiting for your winter uniform that never arrives because it was intercepted by John Paul Jones and his crew. That has ripple effects, right? Not only were the Continental soldiers better equipped now, but the Redcoats were not, and that plays a factor. In this case, I just keep thinking, yeah, they're fighting as hard as they can in spite of their ship sinking. The French sharpshooters are trying to take out guys, but ultimately, it seems like this is a lost cause. At what point does a warrior acknowledge defeat? When do you give up, or when do you try to save your men, or what is motivating you? Because clearly John Paul Jones isn't about to give up. He is concerned for his men based on what we've talked about earlier, but he doesn't. Something else must be driving him. And is it a feeling of narcissism or greatness, where he feels he needs to be best remembered, or he needs to be the top and I'm never going to surrender? He can't have that one bad mark on his career? Or is it just an undying hatred for the English? Who knows? But the fact that the ship is sinking beneath your feet and still you persist, that is what makes the history books.
Here's what we actually know happened, as opposed to what popular memory insists happened. At some point during the battle, with Boham Richard visibly ablaze and taking on water, Captain Pearson aboard Sepphoris calls across to ask whether Jones is ready to strike his colors, to surrender. And Jones, by every surviving account, refuses. The exact wording of that refusal is where the historical record gets uncertain. And it's worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than just repeating the famous line and as settled fact. The words, "I have not yet begun to fight," do not appear in any contemporary account of the battle. Not in Jones's own detailed report to Franklin, written just days later aboard the captured Sepphoris. Not in any log or letter from 1779 itself. The line surfaces decades afterwards, first in a 1806 memoir published by midshipman Nathaniel Fanning, who gives a longer, stranger version of the exchange, and then again in a 1825 biography of Jones based on recollections from his lieutenant, Richard Dale. Fanning, by his own account, was stationed high up in Richard's rigging during the fight, a genuinely difficult position from which to reliably hear a shouted exchange happening on a smoke-filled cannon roaring deck 40 feet below. That doesn't mean Jones said nothing defiant. Every account agrees he refused to surrender a visibly sinking ship in the middle of a battle he appeared to be losing, which is itself a remarkable thing to do, regardless of the precise words. It just means the specific quotable sentence carved onto monuments today may be a later distillation. Historically plausible in spirit, unverifiable in exact wording. What is verified, and arguably more dramatic than the disputed quote, is what happens next with the frigate Alliance. Captain Pierre Landis, whose rivalry with Jones has been building for over a year, sails Alliance into the fight, and instead of engaging Separus, fires a full broadside directly into Bohom Richards' hull, into Jones's own ship, at a range close enough that there is real documented dispute over whether Landis could possibly have mistaken one vessel for the other in the dark. Some of Jones's own crew are killed by that broadside. To this day, historians are not fully agreed on whether this was catastrophic incompetence, Landis genuinely unable to distinguish friend from foe in smoke and darkness, or a deliberate act of sabotage by a man who hated Jones enough to let him die rather than seeing him win. Landis will later be formally investigated and eventually dismissed from American naval service over his conduct that night and in the weeks after. But the full truth of his intentions in that single decisive moment never gets fully resolved, then or now. Somehow, through all of it, the exploded guns, the sinking hull, the friendly fire from his own squadron, Jones's crew holds the lashed together ships together long enough for a French Marine in Richard's rigging to drop a grenade directly into an open hatch on Separus, igniting loose gunpowder cartridges stored on her deck and setting off a chain of secondary explosions that devastate Pearson's own gun crews. It's the single moment that tips a battle both ships are losing decisively in Pearson's direction. With his own vessel now critically damaged, his crew badly thinned, and Jones's Marines still raking his exposed deck from above, Pearson makes the call himself. He personally hauls down Separus's colors just after 10 o'clock at night, ending 3.5 hours of continuous close-range combat. Bohom Richard has won, technically, formally, on paper, the most storied single-ship engagement of the entire American Revolution. She doesn't survive to enjoy it. For the next day and a half, Jones's crew fights a losing battle against the flooding in Richard's hull, pumping and patching around the clock before finally accepting what's been obvious since the opening minutes of the fight. The ship cannot be saved. On September 25th, Bohom Richards slips beneath the North Sea, and Jones transfers his flag and what remains of his crew to the very ship he just captured, sailing Separus into the neutral Dutch port of Toxal as his new command. It's worth sitting with the strangeness of that fact plainly. John Paul Jones wins the most famous naval battle of the American Revolution by losing his own ship entirely and sailing home in the enemy's.
So for a very long time, when I heard the story about where the phrase, "I have not yet begun to fight," came from, I was impressed with the audacity and the levels of trash talk in military conflict that this is. This is just incredible. And then he goes on to fight and capture the other ship. I've always been amazed. Now you are saying that perhaps that wasn't uttered at the time, but may have been added after the fact. And it makes me contrast that time period with the one we live in now, where every misstatement or flub is recorded for all time, for all to see generations from now. And it would be nice to go, you know what I said? I was there. I was on the ship. And you know what I said? I said this. And nobody's, oh, no, check out my phone footage. That wasn't what you said at all. You were defecating in your pants at the time. as my phone video clearly shows. It was a simpler time, but maybe a better time, where we don't have videos of captains on sinking ships defecating their pants. You know what I mean? Not that I'm saying that's what happened to John Paul Jones. I'm not slandering the man. Maybe libel is recorded. Anyway, you get what I'm saying.
I don't think he can sue you, so you're good.
You are underestimating the litigiousness of our society, I believe. Somebody will sue me. Hopefully not. Please, a friend, a family member, but not a lawyer about our podcast. Anyway, what a triumphant move. You take the ship, you transfer your crew, you sail into a neutral port, which I'm sure at the time was this. What was the timeline? I think France was about to formally enter as far as support the United States at this point, but the Netherlands never does, so I can understand why that would be considered a neutral port, but still, how incredible, how bold, how unwavering. And it is inspirational. That's the kind of mettle you want your sailors to have.
News of Flamborough Head crosses Europe fast, and it turns John Paul Jones, Scottish-born, American by adoption, a fugitive under a different name a mere 6 years earlier, into an international celebrity. The kind of fame no other American naval officer of the Revolution comes close to matching. King Louis XVI of France personally receives him, presents him with an ornate gold-hilted sword, and grants him the title Chevalier, Knight of the Order of Military Merit, an honor so specifically French that Jones would spend the rest of his life signing correspondence as Chevalier Paul Jones, whenever it suits him. Congress, back in America, eventually follows suit in 1787, voting Jones a specially struck Congressional Gold Medal. A genuinely rare honor, and one that makes him, to this day, the only American naval officer of the entire Revolutionary War to receive one. On paper, by 1787, John Paul Jones is the single most decorated and celebrated naval officer his young country has ever produced. Set that public triumph against what's actually happening to his career, because the gap between the two is enormous, and it's the real story of the decades that follows Flamborough Head. Jones never receives another independent naval command from the United States after the Revolution ends. Congress, in a gesture meant to honor him, assigns him command of America, a powerful new 74-gun ship of the line under construction in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The kind of major capital warship that would have made Jones finally a commander of genuine naval weight, rather than sloops and converted merchantmen. He never sails her. Before America is even completed, Congress makes a decision to give the ship away outright to France as a diplomatic replacement for a French warship recently lost off the American coast. Jones is left once again without a ship, this time for reasons that have nothing to do with his ability and everything to do with the young United States simply not having the money, the shipbuilding capacity, or the sustained political will to maintain the peacetime navy his own career had helped make famous. What follows instead is years of thankless, unglamorous work. Jones spends much of the 1780s in France as an American agent, chasing down prize money legally owed to American sailors from wartime captures, wrangling with French courts and bureaucrats over payments that trickle in slowly, if at all, and growing increasingly frustrated that the country he helped build a navy for has, in practical terms, no further use for him. This is where the resentments that trailed him throughout his career, the 18th placed ranking on the captain's list, the endless friction with fellow officers, the reputation for self-promotion that made him plenty of admirers and just as many enemies, finally catch up with him in the form of simple, institutional indifference. Nobody in the new United States government is actively working against John Paul Jones in the 1780s. They just don't particularly need him anymore. And a man built entirely around the pursuit of command and recognition finds this kind of quiet obsolescence far harder to fight than any Royal Navy frigate. By the middle of the decade, Jones is a man with an extraordinary reputation and functionally nothing to do with it. He's still Chevalier Paul Jones, still the hero of Flamborough Head, still capable, at 40 years old, of commanding anything a navy would give him. And no navy on earth, including his own, currently has anything to offer. It's a strange, deflating position for a man whose entire life to this point has been defined by seizing the exact opportunity that opens in front of him. For the first time since that yellow fever outbreak handed him his first merchant command at 21, there is no opportunity in front of him at all. So when an offer finally does arrive, not from the United States, but from an empire on the other side of Europe, from a monarch looking for exactly the kind of aggressive, battle-tested naval commander the U.S. Navy no longer has room for, Jones takes it almost without hesitation. It's going to be the best professional decision available to him in 1788. It is also, in ways he cannot yet see, going to be the beginning of the end.
Oh man, I'm not too familiar with this portion of his life, so I'm wary of what's going to happen. What an interesting place he found himself in France, battling the French justice system for prizes that are due to Americans. I'm sure that tenacity that he had helped him, but within the confines of the French judicial system, it's not quite the same as open battle in the Atlantic. So you have to use different strategies, and that may have frustrated him to no end. America in the 1780s, boy, they had a ton of problems, and finding a ship for him to sail with no mission and no direct purpose, I'm sure was the last thing they were thinking about. Currency was out of control. They were serious problems in the new country, so I get that. Yeah, all I can think about is how, the Japanese Emperor Oda Nobunaga would have his samurai, when they were not at war, write poetry and garden, and there were non-wartime purposes for them, so they would still be available and sharp for when war did come. And I don't think this exists in the West at this point, at least. I don't know why he's not doing more merchant shipping. Like there are still opportunities for him to sail, so that's interesting. But when you say in Eastern Europe, I'm trying to guess where he goes because I honestly don't know. 1780s, this is before Germany's around. I'm going to say either Russia or Prussia. Is that, you'll tell me. I'm just going to go on the record. That's where I'm guessing he goes. Yeah, that's all I got. Yeah, it's so difficult when a man so talented like this there's no place for him, to have him lean into his just unfathomable skill set. And I guess it's unfortunate. So yes, continue the story. I got to find out if I'm right.
The offer comes from Catherine the Great.
Yeah, baby! Sorry, go ahead.
Empress of Russia, who is assembling a fleet to fight the Ottoman Empire in the Black Sea and wants proven, aggressive combat commanders rather than career court officers. In 1788, Jones accepted a commission as Rear Admiral in the Imperial Russian Navy. An extraordinary jump in formal rank for a man who never rose above captain in his own country's service. Catherine's confidence in him is, by contemporary accounts, sincere and specific. She reportedly tells associates Jones will get to Constantinople, expecting him to drive Ottoman naval power out of the Black Sea entirely. Jones is assigned to the Liman campaign, the estuary where the Dnieper and southern Bug rivers meet the Black Sea. Commanding the 24-gun flagship Vladimir, alongside a Russian flotilla under the German-born mercenary commander Prince Charles of Nassau-Siegen. In June 1788, Jones gets exactly what Catherine hired him for: a real, hard-fought tactical victory. Operating in close coordination with Nassau-Sigon's flotilla, Jones helps defeat a major Ottoman naval force in the Liman, contributing directly to a campaign that meaningfully weakens Turkish naval power in the region. It's a huge accomplishment. Sound tactical judgment, effective command under fire, exactly the kind of result that made him famous a decade earlier off Flamborough Head. And it's also the last unambiguous professional success of his entire life. Because almost immediately, the credit for that victory gets taken away from him by men with far better access to the Russian court than a foreign-born rear admiral 3 months into an unfamiliar navy. Prince Gregory Potemkin, Catherine's powerful favorite, the man effectively running Russia's southern military campaigns, and Nassau-Siegen both move quickly to claim primary credit for the lineman victories. And their version of events, delivered directly and repeated to Catherine, carries far more political weight than anything Jones can offer in his own defense from hundreds of miles away. Catherine responds by showering them with military honors and rewards, while Jones, the officer whose flagship and tactical decisions were central to the actual fighting, receives comparatively little recognition and finds himself within months effectively sidelined. His authority quietly stripped away, his access to Catherine's court curtailed, his usefulness to the empire that recruited him apparently exhausted less than a year after his one real victory. It's the same institutional pattern that ended his American career, playing out again in a completely different empire. Competence on the water, undone by court politics, Jones had neither the patience nor the standing to navigate. Then in 1789, something far more serious ends any chance of rehabilitation. In St. Petersburg, Jones is accused of sexually assaulting a young girl. The accusation is serious. It is never resolved in any court, and it should not be minimized or explained away. But it should also not be present as settled fact, because it wasn't settled, and it isn't settled now. Jones vigorously denied the accusation and pushed repeatedly, and by his own account, for a formal trial that would clear his name. No such trial ever takes place. Catherine's court already inclined against Jones after the Lyman credit dispute, uses the accusation, whether fully believed or simply politically convenient, to finish what Nassau-Sigen's maneuvering had already started. Catherine quietly declines to respond to Jones's letters at all, and privately tells intermediaries that his record isn't exceptional enough to warrant her continued support, and that Russian sailors are refusing to serve under him as a direct result of the accusation. She goes further, using her diplomatic influence to quietly block Jones's later attempts to find a new command in the Danish and Swedish navies, ensuring the damage follows him across borders. Whether the accusation itself is true, fabricated by political enemies to destroy a man had already decided to discard, or whether something uncertain in between, is a question honest historians still can't answer with confidence. What's certain is the effect. By 1789, John Paul Jones's career in Russia, and in practical terms, his career anywhere, is finished. He leaves Russian service in 1789 and relocates to Paris. A revolutionary hero from one war and a rear admiral from another, with no navy left willing to employ him, and a reputation now trailing 3 separate, unresolved accusations across 3 different decades and 3 different countries. He is 42 years old.
That guy's living life, let me tell you. When you mentioned the accusations in Russia, I was like, what happened? Because like I said, I'm not too familiar with this part of his life. I find that very interesting that there was not a court case. And then there was just, they allowed the accusation to dominate as if he was guilty and used that and blacklisted him. I can't believe he was blacklisted across other countries. What a use of diplomatic power. I don't know if that's true or not, but it should have been resolved. And I appreciate the American system that starts with you're innocent and we need to prove you're guilty. And although not executed perfectly every time, I think that's a good basis for a starting point. And I know the culture in Russia is very different, even from what he's used to as a Scotsman or even when he participated with America. So that way of thinking may have been very different. I'm sure there was a language barrier, although maybe his French, probably he was able to communicate with the court. But I don't see how you command sailors with such a different language set. There's not a lot of commonality between Russian and English or French, I don't believe.
Back during this time, I
Uh,
think French was more the universal language
right.
like English is today.
I see. Okay, then that would make sense, at least. Golly. And then he moves to France right before the French Revolution, thinking, my days of excitement are over. And he's about to be in the middle of a very difficult period for France, we'll say. That's what a pity that he wasn't able to join the Dutch or the Swedish and use his skills. I don't know. This is winding down to a very anticlimactic yet tragic end. And I hope it turns around, but that's not always the way life goes, and I understand that. Let's continue the journey of his life and see what happens next.
What happens to John Paul Jones in his last 3 years has almost nothing to do with naval glory. And that's precisely why it's worth telling honestly rather than skipping straight to the monument. He settles in Paris, increasingly isolated, his health failing. Modern physicians examining the historical record believe he was likely suffering from nephritis, a progressive kidney disease, worsened by years of hard sea service and, by this point, genuine poverty. In 1792, the United States, through Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, does finally offer him one more assignment: an appointment as U.S. consul to negotiate the release of American sailors held captive by Barbary pirates operating out of Algiers. It would have been, in some ways, a fitting final chapter. The Revolution's most famous naval officer deployed one more time to free American sailors from foreign captivity. He never gets the chance. The commission is still crossing the Atlantic when, on July 18th, 1792, John Paul Jones is found dead in his apartment in Paris, alone at 45 years old. A handful of French acquaintances arranged a modest funeral. The king's commissary quietly covers the burial expenses. He's interred in the St. Louis Cemetery for Foreign Protestants, a small, unremarkable plot for a man who 13 years earlier had been received personally by that same king as the hero of Flamborough Head. And then, for over a century, he is simply lost. 4 years after his burial, France's revolutionary government sells the cemetery property and the graveyard, along with any clear record of exactly where within it Jones lies.
What? I didn't know you could sell a graveyard. Sorry. That's nuts.
Disappears under later construction. For more than 100 years, one of the most consequential naval officers in American history rests in an unmarked, unlocated grave beneath what eventually becomes a Paris laundry yard, while the country he helped give a navy to largely forgets to ask where he ended up. It takes until June 1899 for anyone to seriously try to find him, when American ambassador to France, Horace Porter, begins a systematic, expensive 6-year search through old property records, cemetery maps, and burial registers, funding much of it out of his own pocket. In 1905, after years of painstaking archival work and physical excavation, Porter's team finally locates and exhumes a lead coffin containing a remarkably well-preserved body, wrapped in linen and alcohol in a manner consistent with 18th century French embalming practice for a person of some standing. A medical examination comparing the corpse's features against contemporary busts and portraits of Jones, along with documented details of his known cause of death, positively identifies the remains as John Paul Jones. What follows is about as grand a homecoming as any dead sailor has ever received. The body is given a full honor guard procession through Paris, a formal religious service, and passage by special French government train to the port of Cherbourg, where it's transferred aboard USS Brooklyn, flagship of a full American naval squadron that President Theodore Roosevelt personally dispatches to escort Jones's remains home across the Atlantic he'd spent his career fighting on. Roosevelt, an unabashed admirer of aggressive naval commanders, generally, and of Jones specifically, presides over the eventual ceremony himself, delivering a speech praising Jones's audacity and combat record with the enthusiasm of a president actively trying to build up his own modern battle fleet and looking for exactly this kind of usable, inspiring history to justify it. In 1913, after several years in temporary storage, Jones's remains are finally sealed into an elaborate bronze and marble sarcophagus in a crypt beneath the chapel of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, modeled deliberately on Napoleon's tomb in Paris, a level of monumental grandeur that the man himself, dying alone and half forgotten in a Paris apartment 121 years earlier, never remotely experienced in life. So where does that leave us? Be honest about it. He is genuinely contested and has been for decades. Jones never served a single day in the Navy the United States Constitution actually created in 1794, 2 years after his death. Some historians argue the honor more properly belongs to John Adams, who wrote the Continental Navy's founding legislation, or to Benjamin Stoddert, the first Secretary of the Navy who built the institution that actually endured. And Jones's personal record, the Maxwell flogging, the killing in Tobago, the unresolved accusation in St. Petersburg, is not a footnote historians can responsibly wave away in service of a clean origin story. All that is true, and none of it erases what's also true. That a gardener's son from a country with no navy of his own personally hoisted the first American ensign, brought the only real American attack of the entire Revolution onto British soil, and with his own ship sinking under him and his guns exploding around his own crew, refused to surrender a fight that every rational calculation said he should have lost. Whatever we call him, that refusal, messy, self-promoting, morally complicated, and completely historically real, is the reason there's a crypt beneath the Naval Academy chapel at all. And the reason 250 years later, this show is telling his story instead of somebody else's.
I think that was a fitting tribute that he received. It was nice to see both the French and the Americans welcome him home in a way. I'm really impressed with the expense and effort that, what was that gentleman's name that did the expansive record search and trying to locate his grave?
That was Horace Porter.
There are actions, like John Paul Jones could have been forgotten, more or less, and his grave never found. But I think the relentless pursuit of that information to find him by Horace Porter, at his own expense in a lot of ways, from what I understand what you were saying, that makes a huge difference. I want to take this moment as a reminder to our listeners and to ourselves that one person with the focus and determination to see things through can make a humongous difference in the world. The fact that John Paul Jones his remains now rest at the Naval Academy Chapel, that's a testament to Horace Porter's dedication. Like, to have the graveyard sold and turned into a French laundry, that's interesting. But I guess that's what happens. There's not a lot of room, perhaps, in Europe, and so they need to build over as much as they can. I get it. A fitting tribute to a guy that contributed so much to this country when it mattered the most.
All right, that is all I have for you today, buddy. You want to get us out of here?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you again for listening to this episode. Listener, wherever you are, we really appreciate that you joined us. And I hope you learned something. I did, definitely. And if you ever want to tell a friend, a family member, a coworker, a classmate, a grandparent, your pen pal. Do they still have pen pals?
I'm sure.
I bet they do. Yeah. People on your Discord server. There we go. That's modern. Let them know. You can find us, or you can reach us rather, at US Navy History Podcast at gmail.com if you ever want to get a hold of us and say, oh, I found that inspirational, or oh, why did you call out this thing? That's interesting. Let us know. We're here to respond to you. Also, we are on X Twitter with the handle @ give us a shout there as well. And speaking of Discord, which I just did moments ago, you can find a link in the show notes where you can join us and other listeners and talk about stuff. It's a little quiet. We should get some new blood in. Talk about stuff, Navy stuff, history stuff. Yes, that's what we're all about, and we're glad you're with us.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye.